Good morning. Welcome to City Point Church. My name is Nathan, and we're continuing the David study today. I kind of noticed as we've gone along, David's one of those figures in the Bible that everybody knows about. His stories sound familiar, especially the ones that really stick out. The little shepherd boy who's anointed, his defeat of Goliath, the whole Bathsheba debacle, all of that. It's easy to remember, but I've noticed that as we've gone through this series, the stories that I remember the least, or that I've forgotten a lot about, tend to hold a lot of meaning, like a lot of spiritual meaning. And today's story is kind of like that. We're kind of going through this narrative of David, and we've gone into 2 Samuel, and right in between two chapters, both covering David's military conquest, we have this little story that we're going to be talking about today. It's one of the shorter chapters in 2 Samuel, and it's interesting why it kind of doesn't fit a little bit, but it gives us a very, very important glimpse into the person of David. Right, because he is a mighty warrior and he's conquering all these kingdoms, but we have to remember that he is what God called a man after his own heart, and there's a little bit bigger picture that we need to understand. Hopefully through this we can also get a glimpse into our story that God is telling with our lives. So, a little bit of a backstory. Everybody, I'm sure, remembers all the weeks that we've been talking about David. We even split it up with the holiday, so a lot's happened. Right, this little boy was anointed. He killed a giant. Even while another man was king, he was growing up to be the king of Israel. He interacted with this prophet Samuel, he's not on the scene anymore after dying. But needless to say, anytime you have a kingdom with two kings, they tend to not get along. So Saul, the king of Israel, is upset with David, pursues David, causes really a civil war within Israel, and as the trouble develops, it really creates this chasm between Saul and David. We kind of get the picture too that David never feels about quite the same way as Saul. David sees Saul as God's anointed one and has a lot of respect, and that shows up. To complicate matters too, Saul's son Jonathan was one of David's dearest friends. Jonathan and David were loyal to each other. Jonathan saved David's life. And they promised that no matter what happened, no matter what the outcome of this civil war was, that they would look after each other's families, which was a really big deal. Kind of similar to the baby dedication today. The civil war continued until finally both Saul and Jonathan were killed in the battle at Jezreel we talked about a little while ago. David mourned over this loss. And he didn't mourn just over the loss of his best friend, but he mourned over the loss of the king, even though he was promised to be the future king of Israel. And then the chaotic days that follow, all of Saul's descendants end up dying or being killed, except for this one case, one lone survivor. This was typical too. This was common in that day when a king takes over a kingdom. The descendants of the old king were all killed off. So today we're going to talk about a young boy named Mephibosheth. He was the son of Jonathan, the lone survivor of Saul. So as we look back at this story of Mephibosheth, it's kind of an obscure story. It's not one that a lot of people talk about. But it gives us this picture of God's grace to sinners, to people like us. This story picks up right as David he's becoming an established king. He's conquering and building his kingdom. I think it's, you can just imagine David getting all of his royal ducks in a row. And he's sitting around one day remembering all the events that led up to this point. That old man that called him in from the fields to tell him that he was going to be the king. The defeat of the giant. this running that he's done for years and years and years away from Saul, the king that he respects. And God's brought him through all of this. And then he's remembering the death of Saul and Jonathan and that promise that he made a long time ago. And that's where we're going to pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 9. And David said, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there still someone of the house of Saul that I might show the kindness of God to him?" Ziba said to the king, "There's still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lo-debar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, at Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Behold, I am your servant." And David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." And he paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table, like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate always at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. So we're going to look at the restoration of Mephibosheth. We see that his story represents what God's done for each of us. And I think the first point that I'd like to point out is that we were all like Mephibosheth, crippled by a fall. This kind of takes us back a few chapters to understand why this part is part of our story. In 2 Samuel chapter 4, we find that Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth starts off with a distinct disadvantage. This well-meaning nurse, knowing what happens to the son of the king when he's been killed, gets the boy away from danger, and in the process drops him. And so because of that, Mephibosheth grows up crippled in both of his feet. So this child would, for the rest of his life, need the help of others. He would need to be cared for and looked after. He would really be at the mercy of anyone who came looking for him. So his life was probably spent in constant fear. In much the same way, like we, the human race, we've been crippled because of the fall of Adam. We're also at a distinct disadvantage, but in this case it's not because of crippled feet, but our propensity to sin. So being broken means, morally speaking, we can't live up to the perfect standards that God has for us. And physically speaking, we're constantly dealing with pain and sickness and death. Spiritually speaking, we can't make ourselves righteous or perfect enough to approach God. We've been crippled by a fall. So we have the same basic problem that Mephibosheth had. We're broken. We're broken when it comes to pleasing God, especially on the basis of our own deeds. We just lack the ability. So like Mephibosheth, we were crippled by a fall, but the good news is that like Mephibosheth, we were sought by the king. Right? 2 Samuel 9:3 says, "And the king said, Is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God to him?" And Ziba said to the king, "There's still the son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." So Mephibosheth was not searching for the king. In fact, he was doing the opposite, right? He was running away. But fortunately for him, the king searched for him. He was only 5 years old, right? Whenever this nurse picked him up and ran away. Chances are he didn't know David. But because before Saul died, David and Saul didn't get along very well. The families didn't get together for meals and things like that. But David sought Mephibosheth, and he made himself known to Mephibosheth, just like God has sought and made himself known to us. King David went out of his way seeking out this lost son of his friend Jonathan. And fortunately, he was looking for Mephibosheth for good reasons. Because any other king wouldn't have been. He would have been searching Mephibosheth to end Saul's lineage. So in very much the same way, God sends his son Jesus into the world seeking those who are lost, who don't know enough to even seek him. In John's account of the gospel, he writes, "He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him." And in Luke's gospel, Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." So as a general rule, people don't seek after God, right? Mainly because they don't know who he is. They might seek after this concept, right, of something bigger. But when it comes down to God, the God, oftentimes we just run away. We're afraid of what he might think. Or maybe we're just ignorant of the whole ordeal. You know, there's an account of Henry David Thoreau, the naturalist. As he was nearing death on his deathbed, he was visited by one of his aunts. In fact, it said that this was an aunt that he was really close to, and the aunt asked him, "Henry, have you made your peace with God?" And Henry's response was, "I didn't know we had ever quarreled." That answer reveals like this profound spiritual ignorance that lives inside of all of us, right? If we don't outright fear God, we don't know what we should feel. What have we done? Too many people are like Henry. They have no idea that in reality, they're lost, separated from God. They don't know that God is even looking for them. So at least Mephibosheth knew he wasn't an enemy of the king. He knew there was nothing that he could do to make things right. Right? Mephibosheth had done nothing to David. It was Saul that was continually pursuing and trying to kill David. So there was nothing Mephibosheth could do to make that right. He was just born into a lineage of brokenness and corruption. So, unless the king came and sought him out, he was doomed to hide all of his life, continually running. And so, like Mephibosheth, we were sought by the king, and we were found even in a faraway country. So David asked his servant Ziba where he might find Mephibosheth, and the servant explains that Mephibosheth's in this place called Lo-Debar. Lo-Debar was a city on the east of the Jordan River. That's the desert side. Lo-Debar literally means the place of no bread or no pasture. So he was hiding out in this desolate nowhere. Which even makes it more poignant that he had no way of taking care of himself. Not only did he have no way of taking care of himself, but he was lost in a land that wasn't going to take care of him either. Fortunately for him, David sought him out. And fortunately for us, God takes that initiative to seek and to find us. If you remember the parable of the lost sheep, Jesus tells about the shepherd who had 100 sheep and one got lost, and he leaves the 99 to go seek after the one. And you might have even heard it said before, like, if I was the only person that was a sinner, God would send Jesus for me. So God crossed this great divide to seek us out, just like David sought after Mephibosheth. And like Mephibosheth, we're saved, but not because of anything we've done. We're saved because of someone else. Saved for another's sake. David says in chapter 9, verse 7, "Do not fear," speaking to Mephibosheth, "for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all of the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." David loved Mephibosheth from the very beginning. In a way, David loved Mephibosheth before he was even born. So obviously it wasn't for anything that Mephibosheth had done. Mephibosheth, in fact, hadn't really done anything to deserve David's love. He was born into this corrupt royal lineage and had only been running from David. But David didn't seek after Mephibosheth because of anything that Mephibosheth had done. You know, I can understand this in a way, because as a brother, I have brothers in my life, both biological brothers and brother-in-laws, and I love these brothers, right? And that love for my brothers extends even to their wives and to their children. And so I can imagine, like, if something were to happen to them, you know, I would do everything within my power to take care of their family. And even though David and Jonathan weren't biological brothers, they were as close, if not closer. So in much the same way, God loves every one of us, but not for anything that we've done. He loves us because of His Son. He loves us for His Son's sake. We don't have to earn the love. In fact, we can't earn the love. We already have it. His love was given freely, given in the name of His Son Jesus. It reminds me of Paul's letter to the Ephesians. He says, in love He predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of His will, to the praise of His glorious grace, for which He has blessed us in the beloved. Fortunately for Mephibosheth, his story doesn't end as anyone at that time would assume it would. It has a happy ending. And fortunately for us, our story doesn't end like it should. We also have a happy ending. Because like Mephibosheth, we're going to be restored to the king's table. That was David's desire. That's what it looked like to David to complete that promise that he had made Jonathan. In verse 11 it says, "Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servants, so will your servant do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth became part of David's family. Like, he went from living and hiding far away, always running, to eating at the banquet table of the king. The man that he was running from, like, ran to him. And not just that, but he really did the opposite of what was expected. If David had found this little boy and killed him, that would have just been normal at the time. When you take over a kingdom, it's just what you're expected to do. But instead of killing Mephibosheth, David restored him. And In the same way, we have to realize there's nothing strange or unfair about God's judgment, about his justice. In fact, it's what we would expect to happen because it's what we deserve. But instead, God sent his Son, and his Son sought us out, no matter how far we were, to propose to us. Like we're Christ's bride. Jesus has set a place at his banquet table. He found us in that far-off country. He adopted us into his family so that we can sit at his table forever. Like our future is in him because of nothing that we've done. So I think similar to Mephibosheth, I get this just feeling of complete and total unworthiness. Like how do you respond to that grace? The great writer Seneca the Younger records a story of Alexander the Great. Alexander once gifted an entire city to a man. And when the man declined to accept it on the grounds that he was unsuitable, it was unsuitable to his condition, Alexander said this, "I do not ask what is becoming in you to receive, but what is becoming in me to give." The story of Mephibosheth is a reminder of the fact that God actively seeks those who are lost. Like he pursues us in a faraway land and brings us home to eat with him at his table. That kind of love for the lost sinner is deserving of a response. In love and gratitude, we need to reach back to the one who by grace alone has reached out to us. Let's pray.